All right, welcome back to Court of Curiosity. Today I've got Michael Shermer. What's up, Michael?
What's up? Well, here we are in the beautiful hot desert, but it's a dry heat.
Yes, yes. Also have Brett Hall. What's up? How's it going, Brett?
Hello again.
Hello again. We have multiple conversations with Brett already. So today we wanted to talk about lots of things epistemology related, potentially truth, Bayesianism, skepticism, all of that. But I'll just let you ask any kind of questions you want to Michael.
I've been a fan for a long time, all the way back in the 90s when I was an undergraduate. I read your work and I just had a naturally skeptical mind when I was a kid. I'm still a skeptic in a certain sense, but I've come to understand a version of epistemology broadly called critical rationalism. Do you see a difference between a critical attitude and a skeptical attitude, or in your mind are they basically
Depends
identical?
what you mean by critical. I mean, critical just for its own sake, or the evidence is lacking, so you retain some doubt in a Bayesian way. But clarify, what do you like? Give me some examples.
Critical rationalism is basically the idea that the way to make progress is to criticize any idea, whether it's in science via the method of experiment or using argument in philosophy or in morality, that kind of thing, not for the purpose of just saying that because there's a doubt there, therefore we throw this thing in the bin, but rather the mere fact that it survives criticism, much the same way that a species survives in a particular environment, means that it's the best thing we've got at the moment. So criticism viewed in that way is a very positive way of understanding why knowledge survives and what separates objective knowledge from anyone's random guess.
Yeah, I'm good with that. I mean, Popperian falsification is part of science, but there is a sort of a Bayesian another approach from the more positive side that we're accumulating evidence in favor of it, not just trying to debunk it, and we have yet to debunk it, therefore it survived. There's a slight difference there. Here you're kind of in a Bayesian way saying my priors are constantly getting adjusted, so my credence keeps going up and up, never 100%. But if I get up into the 90s, I can be reasonably confident. So I define truth as something confirmed to such a degree it would be reasonable to offer your provisional assent. So truth with a small t, we can never get, it's not like an asymptotic curve that hits reality and now we know we're there. That can never happen because of fallibilism. That is to say, all of us are wrong about probably most things. And that, I'm an atheist, but, if there is a God, one thing I know for sure is it's not you and it's not me, right? So we don't know. So the only way I can tell for sure and accumulate more confidence in my beliefs is to engage with other people just to see if I'm wrong. So at some point, though, I would never use the term the science is settled, because that's been politicized a bit, but that, the theory of evolution is unlikely to be overturned at this point completely, where it turns out the creationists were right. The Earth is only 10,000 years old, and natural selection didn't create all this complexity. It was designed. That's very, very unlikely. It's so unlikely, I don't really give it a second thought. I don't think evolution needs to be put to that particular test to see if it still stands. We've done that for a century and a half. I think now it's fine-tuning. But, other areas, theory of consciousness, how do you explain the hard problem of consciousness? Well, just look at the Wikipedia page. There's 12 different, a dozen different theories. We're not even remotely close to having a convergence of evidence that that's probably the right one and these others are wrong. We're not there yet. So there, you can just, there you're kind of constantly testing is probably more applicable.
Yeah, well, you mentioned confidence there, and immediately that's one of the demarcations between critical rationalism, or you met David Deutsch recently as well, and this Popperian view of knowledge, because the Popperian view of knowledge, and Popper writes at one point, I am not a philosopher of belief. He wants to take the entire study of epistemology and a critical approach to knowledge outside of the realm of psychology. So therefore, we don't even need to refer to how confident someone is. After all, if confidence was at all irrelevant to the matter of whether or not a particular belief was valid, then the mullahs in Iran, for example, are highly confident that they're off to heaven once they destroy all the Jews or once they blow themselves up in a suicide bombing. But of course, we know that their confidence is irrelevant to the project. But even within science, and the example I like to use is prior to 1919, which was the year of Arthur Eddington's experiment to distinguish between general relativity and Newton's law of gravitation. Up until that moment, all of the evidence, so-called, was accumulating in favour of Newton's theory of gravity, and every sensible person at the time likely would have said, well, we should be more and more confident because all the experiments confirm that Newton's law of gravity is in fact the correct description of what gravity is, correct explanation, it's the right formula, you shouldn't doubt it, you'd be silly to doubt it, silly to think that it's not getting more and more true over time or that we shouldn't think it's more true. But the simplistic story is, in 1919, that crucial test was done by Arthur Eddington, which predicted, according to Einstein, the starlight would be bent during the eclipse by some amount, which was different to the amount that Newton's theory predicted. It turned out that Newton's theory was refuted by that experiment. It's not that we threw it in the bin and said utterly useless, but at least at that point we could say it wasn't true. It never was true. No one should have believed it. No one should have been confident in it, even though it had a whole lot of facility and some amount of truth in it. But general relativity, at that moment, was the superior theory, and not because it had accumulated a vast amount of evidence, but simply because it was the only theory we had left. So it's not so much on our worldview about the accumulation of evidence, but the best explanation, because the best explanation, regardless of whether you've got a lot of evidence behind it or almost no evidence, if it's the only explanation, and in science we would call it the scientific explanation for whatever it is.
Yeah, okay, that's a fair example. Although it's good to remember there was more than one expedition. There were two solar eclipse expeditions, yes, one of which did not find that. Although the data was pretty mixed. It was cloudy and the clouds were going in and out. It wasn't quite clear. The measurements were pretty rough. And so Arthur Stanley Eddington kind of edited out those. And then the one data he had, sort of barely better for Einstein than Newton. Newton did predict that starlight would be bent, just not as much as Einstein predicted. And the data that Eddington had from that one particular eclipse expedition more favored Einstein than Newton. But that particular story, as it gets retold in history textbooks, the cardboard version, is always like clear definition, clear support of Einstein. It wasn't that clear. Now, subsequent tests, of course, have borne that out, so fine. But the way you phrase that, it's interesting. It's the last. It's the sort of inference to the best explanation, I guess is one way to say it. It's the last one, the only one we have left. But of course, that implies that there could be more coming that are even better than Einstein, maybe. But again, I guess that still fits the general model of how science progresses, again, through these two methods of sort of verificationism and then falsification. And I think there's just always intention, and the eclipse one is always the classic study in that. There's so many others where it's usually not clear, particularly in the social sciences, on I don't know if you're studying gun control, effects of different gun control state laws across different states by the comparison method. It is really hard to tell what's going on. And I know this because we've covered this in Skeptic. I've debated some gun control advocates about this who claim that it's clear and unmistakable that owning guns and having guns causes crime to decline. So the classic book on this is More Guns, Less Crime. Okay, it's not at all clear like that, right? There's so many data sets, and you're comparing this county to that county, and how many people, even if it's legal, how many actually own guns. I mean, it's just a rat's nest of causal variables interacting with each other. So physics, it's a little simpler in that sense. And so much of philosophy of science has been built on physics and astronomy, cosmology, a little on biology, not much in the social sciences for this very reason, because it's so messy.
Yeah, and the reason I'd say it's more messy, more complicated is because obviously the variables are more difficult to control. There's more of those variables, but also the simple fact of human choice exists in the world. I don't know if you're on board with free will. We don't need to go down that route.
I am. I believe in human agency. Yeah.
Good. Okay. Well, I'm on the same side. And however you come at that, like the inherent unpredictability of human behavior, simply because of the fact we're creative beings, we're creating knowledge. And once you've created some new idea in your head, you've got more options in the world to pick from. And so in a sense, almost, the word social science is almost a misnomer, because as soon as you've got this creative entity, this thing with free will, this thing with agency, you've taken it out of the realm of ever possibly doing a prediction about that system. And if you've taken it out of the realm of doing a prediction, then it's not amenable to the kind of experimental test that you would do in the natural sciences, where you can extract out that idea. So I would just put those kind of things, from psychology through to sociology and economics, even, under this umbrella of humanities, and to get rid of that grey area.
Yeah, in general, that's right. But you know, it's not like what economists do has no connection to science. They're doing good science. You know, these complex mathematical models that economists use. You know, there's some rough generalizations that hold. Here's what tariffs tend to do, you know, and so on.
Yeah.
You know, you raise taxes above a certain level, here are the consequences. You know, you open the borders and have too much immigration, here are the consequences, just economically and so on. Supply and demand curves, you know, these things are pretty well supported. So I don't want to throw them all into the, you know, like it's like English, English lit, you know, where everybody has their opinion of Shakespeare. It's not like that. Okay, and even the application of theories in the social sciences to policies over the centuries, I think we are converging toward the structure of society in a way that is objectively morally superior. You know, and that the arguments back that the Enlightenment philosophers made, Rousseau and Locke and Hobbes and so on, you know, they do correspond to reality in the correspondence theory of truth in a way. You know, should we endorse slavery or not? Should women have the right to vote or not? You know, gay marriage, you know, just take a pick. We have been moving in a certain direction that's not random. And it's not like cultural relativism where, yeah, we don't like slavery now, but, you know, maybe somebody else will like slavery. Well, maybe some other culture where the owners of slaves like it, but the slaves are never going to like it, right? And, you know, women are never going to put up with taking the vote away and give it back to just white men who own property or something like that. We really have made progress that's there for a reason. It's not random. And that political theory and political science and economic science and so on does tend to support that. And so I'm claiming that even just like asking people, where would you rather live, North Korea or South Korea? Or before the unification of Germany, East Germany or West Germany? Everybody knows the answer.
Yeah.
How do they know this? Because we have a human nature. People would rather be free than enslaved. They'd rather be healthy than diseased, and so on. So from that, we can deduce, I think, you know, provisional scientific conclusions about the way things ought to be based on how they really are.
I would say it's really an appeal to good explanations rather than necessarily saying it's part of science. And saying that something's not science is no criticism. After all, what I'm talking about now, epistemology, is not science, I would say. Philosophy, good philosophy, is not science. Popper's criterion of demarcation is falsification. Not a scientific claim itself, can't be falsified, but that is no criticism of that particular theory. When it comes to slavery is a great example, or even communism. A lot of people do point to the data, and so do I, when it comes to South Korea versus North Korea. You can, you know, look at the demilitarized zone and say, either side of this is a refutation of that kind of totalitarian dictatorship. But I would say, even absent the data, even absent looking at any evidence or talking about evidence, well prior to that, you have a good moral argument that stands apart from any of the evidence. And you say, as you say, we have human nature, we have I don't want to use the word sacred necessarily, but there's a deep importance to the value of a human person in this cosmos. And that person needs to be allowed to flourish, to be free, to have liberty, all of that kind of thing. And so we don't need to worry about whether or not North Korea is doing poorly economically and South Korea is doing well. We can just argue from a moral stance that the reason why communism is wrong, or the reason why slavery is wrong, has nothing to do with being able to point at the data at various places about how places that have owned slaves over time tend not to do as well as places that allowed everyone to be free and to be economically productive. You just say, it is inherent to our value as human beings in this world that certain things are objectively right morally and certain things are objectively wrong, regardless of what we might say the scientific data says.
Yeah, here I guess I would move from philosophy to science in this way. I'll give you an example. Ed Wilson was, expert on ants and social insects, and was asked about, I forget what the context was, but communism. And he said, great idea, wrong species.
Yes.
Yeah, it works if you're an ant, but not if you're a human. Okay, so there we're drawing a conclusion about the way things ought to be based on how things actually are. Here's the way humans are by nature. We're not ants, right? So that would be a deduction of, I think, an actual scientific principle of a kind, based on what philosophers have always just talked about, the rights and dignity of humans or whatever, in kind of, I don't know, fuzzy language that sounds morally uplifting, but different from science. I'm saying, actually, no, we can actually ground it also in science. Natural rights theory. Okay, so John Stuart Bentham famously said, rights is nonsense and natural rights is nonsense on stilts. Well, I think he's wrong about that. It's not just randomly our culture happens to like this and some other culture doesn't, and who can say what's right? Right? It's like, female genital mutilation in Somalia. Oh, well, they have their ways, we have our ways. And who could judge which is the better one? We can't, actually. Not because we're Americans or Westerners, but because we're human and they're human. Ask the women how they feel about this. Now, you can't ask a 7-year-old who's being controlled by her father, but, in general, just ask. So the ask first principle, this is the golden rule. How would you feel if this was done to you? The principle of interchangeable perspectives. I put myself in your shoes and ask, how would I feel if this was done to me? Well, I wouldn't like that, right? So, that's a kind of deduction based on evidence that you've gathered from your senses or history.
Yeah, I judge moral systems, political systems, whatever you want to call it, with respect to how well they are able to foster more progress in the objective sense, how well they allow for knowledge creation ever more rapidly. And David Deutsch, in the beginning of Infinity, he says that he's not a foundationalist, nor am I. There's no one idea that's completely off the table when it comes to being criticised, attempting to improve. Not to say that we will improve, not to say that we can't go backwards, anything of the sort. But nothing is a dogma, except perhaps one thing, and that one thing is, do not destroy the means of error correction. So don't attack criticism itself. Don't attack our ability to correct errors. And if you hold on to that as some kind of moral epistemological principle, I think it actually unites morality and epistemology, because it says it's a moral claim, do not do this thing, and the means of error correction is an epistemological claim. So putting those two things together actually sort of turns epistemology and morality into the same kind of thing. But we can judge other societies, we can judge other ways of doing things by the metric of, are they allowing for rapid error correction? So when you clamp down on free speech, or you clamp down on free markets, or you clamp down on anything that is about trying to produce some better society for individuals or for civilization as a whole, then things are going wrong.
Yeah, The Beginning of Infinity is one of my favorite books. I think it's a landmark work of science and epistemology and philosophy, the whole thing. I don't like these artificial barriers, the philosophers are over there in that building and the scientists are over here in this building, forget all that. So the error correction principle apply, okay, free speech, free thought. Our free markets. It's all tied in together. It's the only way. The reason communist economies don't work is because of the lack of information. This is the point Hayek made, that, like, how many bagels do we need in London between 10 a.m. and noon on next Tuesday? Well, there's no bureaucrat that could do this calculation, short of them interviewing every single bagel store for the last year and getting their data of their sales and how much bagel dough they ordered, and then you can make a prediction, something like that. But every bagel store owner knows this because he has to know this. He has to correct his errors based on losing or making money. So, you know, I think, yeah, even markets are driven in that way.
Yeah, even if he could, even if the bureaucrat could somehow using a supercomputer figure out how many bagels are needed, I would still say communism is wrong. I would still say the bureaucrat shouldn't be doing that thing because it's coercive. So in and of itself, it's going to, you know, impinge upon people's freedom to one day be gluttonous, you know, have more than they need in terms of bagels. So even by that metric, so it's secondary to the foundational principle that we want liberty for people, because people are the entities that are doing the error correction. So again, it goes back to, this is one of the reasons I might be against something like you know, capital punishment, because you are destroying the possibility for error correction. There are certain situations where you do want to kill someone, you know, they're about to hit the button for the bomb, or they're about to shoot you, okay, you've got to kill them. But in other circumstances, you don't want to destroy that means of error correction.
Yeah. Yeah, let's see how far we can go with this. So there's other gray area ones like, I don't know, prostitution or pornography, things like this, where I tend to be pretty libertarian or classical liberal, right? You know, people should do what they want. But does not the action of individuals change the environment? I don't know, this is sort of the broken windows theory of crime, right? You allow people to do some graffiti. That's their freedom to do that. Yeah, but it kind of degrades the whole neighborhood and brings it all down and lowers housing prices and, you know, kind of degrades the morals of people or whatever. Does not the government have some role of regulating, you know, what we do?
Isn't that the whole idea of you're allowed to swing your arms as much as you like, so long as it's, you know, outside of a person's nose kind of thing? I think it's a similar idea. The city is not owned by those people who are doing graffiti.
Right.
Now, whether or not going out into the mountains around here or into a tree in the forest and carving something on it, that might be a different situation. But I presume the city is in some sense owned by the state, sort of collectively.
Yeah.
I don't like to use the word collective, but there we go. That's a situation where we do have collective ownership, let's say, over the government buildings, for example, or the local bus stop or something.
Yeah. Yeah, and, you know, or something like polygamy. Why would I object to polygamy? I mean, adults can marry as many people as they want. I don't care. It doesn't hurt me. Yeah, but what if it's in a community where the girls are raised to believe this is the way it's supposed to be, like in these fundamentalist Mormon communities, which still exist in the United States? They're right up there in the border between Colorado and Utah, in these little tiny towns. And is it really fair that somebody, get back to volition and human agency, you know, if you're raised in one of these fundamentalist homes, you have no idea what freedom is really like and how kind of autonomous choices you could be making. You're just told you're going to marry this guy when you're 18, and oh, this guy's 60 years old or whatever, and along with 12 other girls, you know, and then all these other boys are not going to have, you know, it's like, yeah, okay, doesn't the state need to step in and protect those minors from being abused by their own families?
It's interesting because we would say the same. Why do we have more responsibility for, let's say, that community, which may be a part of the United States? And so if you're here in California and some Mormon community that you're talking about exists over there in Utah, why is that any more of your concern than, let's say, the poor girls in Afghanistan? Or name your place around the world where people are being mistreated and that we could intervene and would have the power to do something positive if we wanted.
Interesting. Yeah. I guess if you just ask me, how does any of this affect me personally? Well, probably not at all. I'm just content riding my bike and writing my books in Santa Barbara. What do I care? Well, because I do think we have a moral obligation to care what happens to other people. You know, it's Peter Singer's, you know, argument about you're walking by a pond and there's a kid drowning and you got your $500 boots. You know, would you sacrifice your boots to save the kid? Oh, people go, oh yeah, of course. Well, okay, there's no kid drowning, but there's a kid in Afghanistan. If you send him $500, you know, it's the equivalent of doing that. Would you do it? And people go, oh, maybe not, right? You know, so I find those arguments compelling. Like, yeah, so we probably should do something.
It's possibly in the real life case, because these are very abstract notions in one sense, because if we do talk about the girl in Utah that we could actually do something about, practically what would happen? Well, practically what would happen is you'd have to have some kind of talk with the girl to persuade her that what you're doing for her is good, because obviously just dragging her out is a use of coercion that you don't want to do. And she's going to actually suffer and feel a heck of a lot worse than what she did before you extracted her from what you're calling this, which I would agree is this terrible situation she finds herself in.
Yeah. I find the concept Thomas Sowell talks a lot about of conflicting rights. There's no solutions, there's just compromises. Much of life is like that. We can't find the answer, but some answers, well, this is your good explanations, bad explanations. Some are better than others, but none of them are perfect. I'd say a lot of rights things are like that. Like I've been commenting recently about, trans athletes. These are trans women who are men competing in women's sports, okay? So I mean, almost everybody is against this, but there's maybe 8 to 10% think it's okay. They want to be supportive. I'm a good liberal. I want to be tolerant, and yeah. But what about the women whose rights are being violated? She could have been second place, now she's third place, or she could have been third place, now she's not even on the podium. That hurts her. So somebody is being hurt. Yeah, but I want to support trans, but I want to support women. I want to support trans. All right. Well, you can't do both, right? Something has. Sorry, that's just the way it goes. There, I think we could actually make a rational argument that we should favor the women because they already have the rights. They fought for those rights for centuries. They fought for those sports rights since the 1970s in Title IX and so on. Before you take rights away from somebody, you better have a really good argument why you should allow the trans women in because they're going to be harmed. Something like that.
Is the phrase, there are no solutions, only trade-offs, another way of saying problems are inevitable, or is there some other conflict there?
I just disagree with Sowell's nomenclature a little bit. I would say that a trade-off is a solution of a kind. I think what Sowell has in mind when he uses the word solution is something like a mathematical solution that is, some platonic ideal perfect thing. But there are no such things in real life, of course, but the word solution in the Popperian worldview would just be an answer to a question, provisional, and can always be improved on.
Yeah, it resolves the conflict between ideas there.
Yes.
Yeah, great. And I just love this type of conversation in a more meta way. This is kind of like a naturalistic solution to a source of nihilism that people have they usually trip over morality. Getting morality from a secular, scientific, or philosophical standpoint, it's like, this is the kind of conversation I'd love to see happen more often with more people. Just this kind of thing. But why? I think wokeness is a kind of thing that fills a certain void. But if this was more popular, would wokeness have even had to have come?
Yeah, interesting. Maybe. I do think that this whole naturalistic fallacy, you can't derive an ought from an is, and so on, is a red herring that's throwing off a lot of people from giving it a try.
As David Deutsch said, you can't even derive an is from an is in many cases, certainly in science.
Right.
So
that's
anyway.
Right. It's funny. Yeah, he's such an interesting guy. His mind wanders off into places like, whoa, where did that come from? Yeah, I love that. Yeah, so I think it's how do philosophers say, it's a thin argument. It's thin, right? Maybe in some places you can apply it, but there's a lot of areas where you don't need to apply it. Like we should know the way things really are or is, and then derive. So we ought to do this. People prefer democracies over autocracies and tyranny, so we ought to promote democracies. Now you can't force people to adopt democracy like we tried in Iraq. Okay, but we should do what we can.
And it's interesting, the number of conversations I've had here from people who are strongly arguing to preserve religious traditions in some way, perhaps not with the supernatural parts, but they see no other option. And I understand the impulse because of things like postmodernism and a sort of a naive version of atheism where you just go, well, let's just reject all the beliefs so-called that we previously had about morality and God and whatever, what are you left with? Well, obviously you're left with nothing. So the woke solution is, well, let's step in and fill that void with utter and complete nonsense. But there's, of course, a better way to go. In rejecting God or in rejecting religion, you're not rejecting what we know about human nature. And you also don't need to reject, and in fact, I think this is what Deutsch gifts us in particular, is he returns human beings and people to the center of the cosmos in a particular way. Not by saying the Earth is the center of the universe, but rather, unlike Stephen Hawking, who said human beings just a chemical scum on a typical planet orbiting a typical star in one among, hundreds of billions of galaxies. But Deutsch says here on planet Earth, so far as we know, it's the only place which is generating solutions, an open-ended stream of knowledge creation. It could stretch out, if things don't go completely wrong, to the stars, to the other galaxies. That is an exciting moral claim about the world, about why we should continue to be optimistic about the future and make progress, which I think leaves in the dust anything that traditional religions say, and it doesn't require you to take anything on faith or to believe anything supernatural. It's just an admission of what we are, beings that want to create knowledge, create technology, and utilize resources as well. Utilize resources so that we can flourish here on this planet and perhaps on other planets as well.
Yeah, second, I'd like to say that we are a way for the cosmos to know itself.
There you go.
And hopefully there's others out there that also help the cosmos know itself. But so far as we know, we're it.
Mm-hmm.
So we should that was his point. We should be careful, make the best of it. We should take care of our planet. And if you want to go full Elon, we should go elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Not just Elon, but yeah, I agree. Yeah, there should be no limit. I like David Deutsch's, I consider optimism. I asked him about this. I think he said he's not an optimist, maybe a realist or something. He didn't like that word because optimism implies I'm just sort of blindly positive about the future. He's not. No, there's a good argument. There's reasons to be optimistic.
Yeah, he calls that naive optimism, which is basically a mirror image of pessimism.
Oh, right.
The optimism, we often say, optimism in David Deutsch's sense is, there's two sort of versions. One is that problems are soluble, so whatever problem's before you, you can find a solution. Or also his principle of optimism is all evils are due to a lack of knowledge.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes, I like that argument, I mean, there are no witches, so burning women as witches was a mistake. That was an error. They had a false theory of causality of what causes diseases and weather events and so on. Yeah, for sure. All right, now let's see how far we can go with there are no insoluble problems. How about the hard problem of consciousness? As it's currently defined, it is what it's like to be something.
Yes.
Like, what's it like to be a bat?
Thomas Nagel.
How would I know? I'm not a bat. What's it like to be you? How would I know? I'm me, I'm not you. And then the idea that I could know what it's like to be you by, transporting over there. I mean, it's like this crazy dualistic theory. Like the little homunculus in my mind goes over and looks at the red in the Cartesian theater of your mind and go, oh, his red looks like mine. Okay, this is nonsense. None of this can happen, right? So I do wonder if the hard problem of consciousness, it's not just a hard problem, it's an insoluble one because we're phrasing it the wrong way. Maybe we need a different definition. I mean, Christoph Koch famously just paid David Chalmers a case of wine because they bet 25 years ago, Christoph said, we will have the hard problem solved in 25 years. Didn't happen. And it's not even close. Again, just go on Wikipedia. You can look at the dozen different, maybe there's 20 different theories, and there's maybe 4 that are kind of converging. Like these are the 4 most popular ones among neuroscientists and philosophers of mind. But we still don't know. And I'm contending it could be we've come about this the wrong way and that we're not going to solve it down this path. I would say the same thing with string theory. I don't know anything about it, but I'm told by people that study this, it was the wrong idea. We're never going to, it's insoluble the way we're approaching it. Throw it out and start completely new.
Yeah, that use of insoluble would just say that this particular route is an error,
yes,
but not that the problem necessarily isn't. So it's amazing how often this comes up. I mean, Sam Harris likes to say that the hard problem of consciousness is rivaled only by why existence kind of thing. So it's the only other problem that seems to have the same character of it's difficult to even formulate what you're talking about.
Yes.
And when I've made the claim, I don't know what you think about this one, with Peter Boghossian, that we have minds that are universal. And the universality of our minds means that we can understand in principle, not necessarily in practice, but in principle, literally any physical phenomena anywhere in the universe. So it doesn't matter what it is. You know, we could talk about the quasar on the other side of the universe, which has a physics that is so different to the human brain that it's almost impossible to think of two objects that are different one from another. However, astrophysicists over time build up models and explanations inside of their minds, which come to replicate. There's like a one-to-one correspondence between the explanation here and what is actually happening with that quasar out there. That's just one example. You can apply that to literally any physical process that's going on anywhere, which means our minds are universal. However, when I explain this to Peter, of course, he immediately lifts up hard problem of consciousness. Now, how does that fit into this universal understanding of the cosmos? Well, I just say, yeah, it's a problem, but I don't see anything different in character, except there does seem to be something missing in our present understanding of science, which doesn't even allow us to formulate the question in scientific terms. All we can say is what Nagel has said, you know, and people have been saying for decades. What is it like to be a bat? What is it like to be Reed Nice Wonder? You know, we can't say anything more than that.
One possible solution to this might be Neuralink.
I was about to say that.
Oh, that's what you're thinking. I got it now.
This is actually something David brings up, and like some kind of like, you know, technology that could be created to simulate senses of other creatures within your mind using technology. So it could be like an aesthetic thing too.
Yes, and he talks about, I think at one point, and it's an old thought experiment. I can't remember who originally did it. I think a nurse might have invented it or something or other. But a person who might be colorblind and can't see, for example, blue at all, but if they're a scientist, a neuroscientist who has invented a cure for this particular kind of colorblindness, they can predict very well that after they implement the cure on themselves, maybe they just swallow a pill and it fixes up the cones inside of their retina or whatever, they can predict that they will see blue, but they won't be able to predict what seeing blue will be like.
That's right. I mean, we can understand the wiring of the brain, but what it's actually like to be the wiring, that's a different conceptual problem, I think. All right, how about God? Is this a soluble, I mean, what's the question? Is there a God? All right, how do we solve that problem?
I think these are all on a par if they put themselves outside of the realm of our capacity to use the tools of science to come at, or even to use the tools of reason to come at. It's one of the reasons I reject, for example, the simulation hypothesis that people talk about, even sophisticated versions of the simulation hypothesis like Nick Bostrom's, that it's simulation inside of simulations because, just for the audience perhaps, in the distant future people are going to be able to create inside of their own computers simulated universes, which inside of those simulated universes will be people who have computers in which they simulate universes, and so it goes on fractal-like. And so we should expect, as a matter of probability, that we ourselves therefore must be in a simulated universe rather than base reality. Now that holds itself immune from criticism, except by saying, well, it's holding itself immune from criticism. It's an appeal to the supernatural kind of thing. So I put God into the same bucket as that. They're all things that if you say I can't use evidence, if I can't use argument, if I've got no way of actually criticizing in order to rule out that particular theory, then it's almost like I don't care about it. You can believe what you like.
I had Nick on my podcast and I asked him that very thing, like, how can I tell the difference? Is there some test I could run? He goes, no. I go, then what are we talking about? I mean, we might as well be talking about Star Trek and some of the fun episodes or something. It's like, maybe, but.
my favorite one ever was a philosophy professor of mine. He said, you know, here's a theory for you. All of reality just came into existence right now, including you and your memories. I mean, we can't rule that out either, but it's just ridiculous to assume.
Argument about the navel. You know, did Adam and Eve have navels?
Yes.
Right? Well, but God could have created all of us 5 minutes ago with all our memories, and he put the fossils in the ground. And okay. Yeah, but how likely is that? And also, but I did push Nick on this too, with the simulation inside the simulation. Would there not have to be somewhere the original hardware where the first program is run? And he said, yeah, there'd have to be some well, then there has to be a memory limit to run all those simulations, and that would be, I guess, the memory capacity of the entire universe. That's not infinite.
No, and people who are interested in explanations simply want to know, if you're told this, we're running inside of a simulation, on what computer? Obeying what laws of physics in what base universe? They're the questions that a real physicist would be interested in, rather than knowing there's this long chain between you and being able to find those answers. And so long as we can continue, if this was a simulation, to do science, to make progress, to improve, to have flourishing lives and generate lots of wealth, who cares in the end anyway? Because it makes no difference to our capacity to do that.
Here's another argument I make is, you know, when you're talking to somebody on your iPhone and they start pixelating because the connection's not great, there's some limit. How come I never get any pixelating here? Like if all of a sudden you froze and you were like, all pixelated, I think, oh, okay, we're in the simulation. But that never happens. So
I think Paul Davies had, it might have been the Goldilocks Enigma or something like that, one of the books that he wrote about the fine-tuning problem, which is an interesting one, that if we were in a simulation, you might expect that if you were measuring certain constants of nature, like the gravitational constant, there would come a point at which it would terminate, and that would be an indication that you'd reached the memory limit of this simulation. But if that doesn't happen, then we're not in a simulation. But who knows if it doesn't terminate at the 30th decimal place or something like that. But that was the only time I heard of some kind of, apart from your pixelation test, some test for being in a simulation.
Yes. Yeah. Now, back to the God question thing, I guess it depends what you mean by God. So you push theists on this, you know, they kind of hit a wall. Like, well, you know, God is outside of space and time. Well, where is that? And what does that even mean? And how would I know? Because I'm in space-time. If he's a supernatural being and I'm a natural being, how does a natural being know what a supernatural being is? And in any case, most people think that believe in God, that God intervenes. There's some, you know, divine providence going on. He cured Aunt Mary's cancer after we prayed. Okay, how did he do that? Right. So a good explanation, a bad explanation is he just did it. It was a miracle.
Magic.
Right. A good explanation would be like, well, he went in and manipulated the DNA of the tumor, like we try to do with, you know, injecting viruses inside of a brain tumor, like they did with Jimmy Carter, and he lived for decades longer. Is that what you think God does? He just like gets in there and tinkers. And how did he do this in the history of life? Did he change the RNA to the DNA? You know, how did he do this? I always ask intelligent designers, here are the big gaps, right? The origins of the universe, the origins of life, the origins of complex life, the origins of morality, consciousness. Anyway, so it's like, okay, so otherwise evolution was just grinding along, creating stuff, and then like, uh-oh, we've hit a wall, and then the deity, the intelligent designer, comes in and goes, okay, we're going to make RNA into DNA, and then it's off and running. Yeah. I mean, is that what you think happened? Or is it the fall of every sparrow, as they say? You know, every single cell that divides, God is in there. No, I don't think that's the, okay. And then it gets, you know, hopelessly muddled.
God of the gaps, and I like Richard Dawkins talking about when creationists come to him with a gap in the fossil record, you know, the missing link kind of idea. You know, here's one fossil stratum, here's another fossil stratum, but there's no continuation between them. If you do come along and provide a missing link between them, they will just say, well, now you've created two more links. You've doubled your problems.
He got that idea from me.
Oh, did he?
Yeah, and he cites me in the God Delusion for that, because I did a debate with Dwayne Gish once, and he had this. It was the week they discovered Ambulocetus natans, which is the transitional fossil between whales and land mammals, right? So there's the land mammal, here's the whale, and you know, and Gish is going, there's a gap there, and I go, well, here it is filled, and then he goes, now there's two gaps, right? So in the case of the creationists, in terms of bad explanations, the more evidence you have, the less they believe, right? So it's like, okay, that is not how it works, right? But anyway, back to just one more thought on the God thing. I mean, is it possible that there are limits to human knowledge? If we had a brain the size of Jupiter or something, we would understand, I don't know, multi-dimensions or string theory or dark energy, I don't know what. And we just can't know because we just can't conceive of it. Yeah.
Anything that's held up as, and again, this is what religious people do, is of course they hold up God and they say, you're puny human. My father does the same thing. Your puny human mind can't comprehend the mind of God, and so you don't even bother trying. Now, scientifically minded people, quite often, Neil deGrasse Tyson has said a similar thing about scientific stuff. They will say, for example, Neil deGrasse Tyson's case, perhaps the laws of physics that succeed general relativity and quantum mechanics will be so complex mathematically or in some other way conceptually that we won't be able to cognitively be able to understand those laws of physics. But that's just holding up God again. It's just saying, here's an incomprehensible thing. Why? Because our minds are too puny. Better to have the optimistic idea, and I think rational idea, that we just keep applying reason, we keep applying science, and we can make incremental progress. Not inevitably, but what's the alternative? To just give up, throw our hands up and say, no, we are too puny after all, we can't understand the
Yeah,
mind
well,
of
I
God.
agree with you, but that is one of the arguments you hear. That, or if we want to channel our inner Joseph Campbell or Jordan Peterson, are there mythological truths? The stories are not true. There are no dragons, but the stories about dragons represent something else that is true about human nature or human society or something like that. How far are you willing to go with that?
Look, again, these are the conversations that I've had repeatedly. Of course, there is going to be useful information in holy texts or in certain traditions. They discovered something correct. Obviously, it was better for all the Jewish tribes to come together under Judaism rather than having internecine war constantly. And an organised religion that keeps a society stable, allowing some amount of progress over time, is preferable to purely tribal violence. Now, the tribes learn something about reality, the religions learn something about reality, but we're escaping from that now. And we are the ones, Sam Harris says, we are the ones who come along and look at the religious traditions and say, that's useful information, that's some knowledge there that we can preserve, while discarding the rest. So if you're doing that, and Jordan Peterson does the same thing, there's passages that must be ignored. And you're doing that not for religious reasons, you're doing that for modern Enlightenment reasons.
Yeah, I agree.
Speaking of things you've said before, Peter gives this quote all the time. He says, don't tell anyone you're smart, make predictions.
Shut up and calculate? Is that one of the quantum physics guys?
Yeah, well, yes.
But I think what Peter's attempting to say there is that, the highest form of being smart is, at least partly, is being able to have a model that makes predictions. But critical rationalism would say there's some other things that are potentially more important than mere predictions.
And it goes to what we were talking about earlier. As soon as you step outside of that domain of the hard sciences, physics, chemistry, geology, those kind of things, you enter a realm where human choice and human creativity is going to make not just substantial differences that cannot possibly have been anticipated prior to a person making that choice. They're going to create knowledge and radically change the future. The thing that I've been on my hobby horse about recently is so many doomers coming out. The tech world seems to be divided, X seems to be divided in two camps, between the effective accelerationists who want to get to the AI as fast as possible. They almost think it's thermodynamically inevitable if you were to listen to them. And on the other hand, a whole bunch of other people who are saying, slow down progress because the doom is coming. Every scientist or technologist has their own way of imagining the fate of the Earth in the distant future. You ask an astronomer, the comet's going to hit us. You ask the geologist, the Yellowstone National Park's going to go off. The virologist, the next pandemic's going to wipe us out. Climate change is going to kill us. AI is going to kill us as well. All of these things, people can make predictions, but I just think it's silly to try and do so, because what will happen in the future depends crucially upon the knowledge we get to create. So trying to use the knowledge we have now to make a prediction about a very distant future that is going to be affected by technology they can't even imagine, because they think they can extrapolate from, the number of CPUs or GPUs that happen to exist in large language models now, is a fool's errand, because we don't know what's coming tomorrow, let alone 2 weeks from now.
No.
If you could predict that all, who was going to predict the missiles were going to start landing, as we just started filming this today, in Tel Aviv? That wasn't on anyone's, or maybe it was on some people's, but even if it was on somebody's dance card, that doesn't mean that they had some special insight. They're just randomly guessing.
Yeah, conjecturing and then criticism. That's another key piece of this, is that we don't derive from facts or evidence, mechanistically. We creatively guess, conjecture an explanation, and hopefully have multiple that we can use evidence then to test and choose between.
And it's also the distinction between prediction versus prophecy. Deutsch talks about this as well, that predictions can be made. Scientific predictions absolutely can be made. Take this antibiotic, it will cure your infection. Drop this ball, I will tell you when it will hit the ground using the Newton's laws of physics or general relativity, whatever it happens to be. Acid plus base gives you salt plus water. These are scientific predictions and they're legitimate to make. But a prophecy is an attempt to pretend you're making a prediction when human choice and human knowledge creation is going to get involved. After all, if I say, using my laws of physics and using projectile motion, I'm going to throw the ball and it's going to land precisely over there, it doesn't matter how good my calculator is or how precise my measurements are. If some person comes running in and catches the ball before it hits the ground, that was never a prediction to begin with. It was a prophecy that tried to ignore human action. That's a simple example, but at the level of civilization.
Yeah, but the element of the person coming into the scene to grab the ball, you're not claiming that's just random. I mean, this person made a decision and you just failed to notice him. So a better model would include the guy jumping into the scene.
If I was to say, before I made this prediction, assuming no person comes into the scene, assuming that everything's controlled, then I've made a prediction, fair enough. But this is my point, that when people make the doom prophecies about what's going to happen with AI, and they get the consultancy fees and they write the books and everything. They don't say these kind of things. They just say, this is what's going to happen because I'm the expert and I'm telling you.
Well, this is why I like the financial markets, or the betting markets. Like what is it? The long bet, I think, is one of them where, put some money on it. So I've been making these kind of bets with the ufologists, and the UAP guys who go like, this is the year, disclosure's coming. And like, all right, how about we put up $1,000 each. By December 31st this year, we will have unmistakable disclosure. All the media will cover it, and we'll all know the aliens are here. Nope, I don't want to make that bet. So you're not that confident that it's coming, right? Same thing. Now, I think to throw a more random element into it, I do think contingency and chance plays a much larger role in how things work out than any scientific model ever wants to admit. Because how do you control for randomness and contingency? I don't mean quantum randomness. I mean just what's called the Jorge Borges' metaphor of the garden of forking paths. You went left instead of right, you zigged instead of zagged, and you end up over here instead of over there. And that there's just so much randomness to it. So complex that even the people acting, like this is the problem of like predicting who's going to commit suicide or which kid's going to go on a shooting spree at school or whatever, they themselves probably don't know. We know that from research on suicide of people that attempt it and fail, and then they give an interview. I don't know what came over me. I just got up in the morning and went, today's the day. I don't know why. I just feel like it. And I think a lot of that, is Putin going to invade Ukraine? I know several years ago, before you could see something was going on. Maybe Putin himself didn't know until this is the week. This is it. I've decided we're going to do it. Something like that. I think there's a lot more of that than social scientists especially want to admit. Because how do you control for that? You predict it. You can't.
I think, and again, this is your wheelhouse. It's almost a sign of a charlatan when you hear the person making the confident prediction about the future. I know that some people see it as almost like a gold standard to delineate between, well, a genuine expert and not a genuine expert. But I think genuine experts are naturally going to be fallibilists. They're going to kind of caveat any guess about the future with all sorts of hedges. But people out there, it doesn't matter how well credentialed they are, if they're saying that such and such is going to happen 10 years from now, 100 years from now, got to be extremely skeptical. And it just sounds to me like you're grifting. You're wanting to convince people about a doom scenario, because if you can do that, you'll be invited on the podcasts. You'll be taken seriously. Perhaps you'll even get authority of the government, because if you've managed, and this is why it's my bugbear when it comes to AI, if you're working in the AI sector and you manage to convince a sufficient number of people that the AI doom is coming, then the government might very well say, aha, better start regulating in a way that you tell us to, because you're told us that doom is coming. But just by the way, you happen to be CEO of a major AI company, so of course you're going to craft the regulation such that it's going to be advantageous to your company. So it's a nasty sort of phenomenon that we're dealing with now. Of course, experts are extremely important for civilization, but the flip side is that the expert can know they're an expert and can know that they can use that expertise to pull the wool over the eyes of the authorities, which is why I like to distinguish between experts and authorities. I think they're quite separate.
Phil Tetlock's work in his book Super forecasters.
Yes, I
Yeah.
do. Yes.
Yeah, so there he's making a distinction between the actual experts who are making Bayesian type calculations and just saying, there's a 50% chance that by December 31st, 2025, Putin is going to do X, versus, all dictators are bad and they do bad things. He's going to do something bad by this, or all free markets do this, or all communist states do that, or, there's kind of grand sweeping ideologies. And if nobody holds your feet to the fire, they just make endless prophecies, I guess you'd say, rather than predictions. And then they're never wrong because no one challenges them at the end of the year going, hey, how come this didn't happen? Sort of like the psychics used to, make their predictions at the beginning of the year in the tabloids. But at the end of the year, no one tallies them up. All right, you got 3 out of 200 right.
Yeah.
What went wrong? Now, in terms of AI, back to a kind of a Deutschian, is that how you would say it, Deutschian? A way to think about it is, that I think about it is, any of these, like what's going to happen with tech, should we do something about it now, the precautionary principle. It's like, no, let's just wait and see if a problem develops. Perfect. So I have a Tesla, and I'm told by some of my more doomsday oriented programming friends, somebody could take over the wheel of your car right now, because you're online, and drive it into a wall. It's like, okay, why have they done it? And they could do it for like 10,000 Teslas at the same moment as a terrorist attack on the 405 freeway in LA. Just bam, crash them all up. It's like, okay, how come that hasn't happened? And planes are going to be falling out of the sky. Why aren't they doing it? And I never get a good answer. Like, other than you just wait. It's coming.
You just wait, yeah.
Okay, how about we just keep going, and then if a plane falls out of the sky or if my Tesla gets driven into the wall, then we can take it up and solve that problem.
It's always a you just wait thing. It doesn't matter what these doomsday scenarios are. It's you just wait, it's coming. Okay, it wasn't this year, it'll be next year, it'll be... And on Bayesianism, now I'll just throw this at you. Often you hear people quote numbers, and when it comes to Bayesianism, there's various different flavors of this. Some people just talk about, I'm updating my priors and then I'm going to give you a new prediction. But sometimes people put very precise numbers on it. The numbers, it appears to me, and I've looked into this at some length, at some depth, they're arrived at by subject matter experts, and they make it up out of whole cloth. Yes. And in fact, it doesn't represent anything at all except a subjective feeling they have, and they assign a number to their confidence. And you actually see it on social media now and again from certain experts. I've now updated my prior to, 90% of an AI apocalypse before the end of 2030 kind of thing. It's like, well, how did you get the 90%? Why not 91%? Why not 8? But of course, then I press people and they say, oh, well, it's not really an exact number. It's just a guess. Well, so why mention the number then? Why not just tell us this is your guess? You're more scared than you were yesterday.
Do you know the bet between Steven Pinker and Martin Rees about a doomsday virus? So they made this before COVID-19, and the bet was, by, I think it was December 31st, 2020, there would be a virus that would kill more than 1 million people. No, it was a bioterror attack that would kill more than 1 million people. And then, of course, COVID did kill more than 1 million people, but then it wasn't clear, is that a bio attack? Is it a lab leak, or is it the zoonomic? So if it's a zoonomic, then that's not a terror attack. But even the lab leak, that was never the lab leak theory was never that they did it intentionally. It was just, a screw up, because those happen. Anyway, so they ended up putting that bet on hold. But I like that idea. At least Steve was willing to take a bet on that.
Yes. There's at least one excellent debate online all about optimism between Martin Rees and David Deutsch. Martin Rees taking the pessimistic view, and also taking the view against the perspective I often talk about, that people can understand anything. Martin Rees thinks that understanding itself is something non-physical, non-computational. So therefore there's something about the human brain that in fact can't be replicated by a regular computer. And so therefore you can't program AGI, because there's something about our wetware or something about understanding that stands apart from
but he's
the action of matter.
But he doesn't think there's a mind separate from the brain, because he's a materialist atheist, right? So what is this other thing?
I don't know. I can't.
See, a lot of people do that. Yeah, I'm not a supernatural, I'm an atheist, whatever, a materialist. but but there's this kind of subjective feeling like there's something floating around up there that's different from the hardware that's running it. I don't know. Yeah, well, Paul Bloom calls us natural born dualists. It's hard not to be a dualist because it feels like I'm different from the stuff. Okay, that is me, I am, but
I think the computer scientist Jaron Lanier describes himself as a disciplined dualist. He just admits consciousness exists, but won't say anything further about what form it takes or anything like that.
Well, what about just saying, consciousness is full stop. Explanation has to stop somewhere. That's where it stops. I don't know. What do you think about that? I've heard this argument.
I would never say explanation stops. I think there must be a rational explanation for what consciousness is. We just don't know what it is at the moment. I've often thought that maybe it's just the flip side of creativity. Human beings have this unique capacity on planet Earth for generating explanatory knowledge, appreciating art, being moral, all of this sort of stuff, which actually reduces to this universal problem-solving capacity. Things that cats and dogs and all the other animals and species don't have. And so I kind of think, well, from the outside, when I look at you, I can see you as a creative person, but I cannot experience your consciousness. But on the inside, you experience consciousness. So I think it might be two sides of the same coin. If an entity can have a universal capacity for explanation, just maybe by virtue of that fact, they're conscious. I'm not committed. I believe that. I just think it's possibly an option.
Yeah. I just did this show with Piers Morgan with this guy, Michael Shermer, who's a neurosurgeon and a Christian who believes we have a soul. So he believes the mind exists separately from the brain. He's not sure where this is or how this happens, but anyway. So, then Piers asked us at the end, can computers ever be sentient? And he's like, no, because they're computers. That you have to be alive to have a soul. So he's making another move there where that life itself is a different kind of thing than just the hardware is up and running, right? And to me, yeah, sure, of course it could be, data could be sentient. Well, how do you know? Well, of course I don't know you're sentient, the philosophical zombie. But here's my argument for that. The Copernican principle, we're not special. Copernican principle applied to myself. I'm not special. And so therefore, if I see in you similar reactions that I give, and I know how I feel when I'm reacting this way, there's a pretty good chance you're also feeling it. It's sort of a Bayesian argument. High probability you're also feeling inside what I feel inside. And therefore, if you had, instead of Brett Spiner playing data, it was an actual data, I would be willing to grant it sentience. If it passed the uncanny valley, it's like, yeah, it sure feels like a person. Okay. Probably he has some inner experience. Don't know for sure, but I don't know for sure with you.
I wouldn't even use the word probably in that case. I would just say, I know you're sentient, because know in my nomenclature does not mean am certain that. It just means that's my best guess about the situation.
Yes, nice.
And in fact, you're violating a law, you're literally violating a law of physics. In fact, deeper than that, a principle of physics, the Church-Turing principle, which is that all physical processes are computable, and that's been proved in fact by David Deutsch when he laid down the foundations of quantum computation. So it doesn't matter what the physical thing is out there. We can, in principle, write a computer simulation to simulate that thing. You can simulate Newton's laws, you can simulate the motion of a galaxy. In theory, of course, computationally intractable at the moment, we could write a program that simulates the action of your brain. And that thing, that simulation, would be computing what your brain is computing, and therefore thinking the thoughts that your brain is in fact thinking, and therefore, on this theory, it must also be conscious, unless you're willing to say that consciousness is something supernatural. Because if a computation is being simulated, the computation is actually occurring. So the computation that's happening in your head is just input data, output data, so too would the computer be. So unless you're willing to say, well, the laws of physics are wrong, which is possible, you're going to have to appeal to the supernatural to say that the computer can't possibly be conscious.
Yeah, that argument, I would hear some people say that would potentially lead to a kind of nihilism situation, because they probably are thinking of it in reductionist terms, that if we're just a computer and our consciousness is a result of that, then I'm not really an actual human or a free agent. But Deutsch would say, no, there's different levels of analysis here. There's emergent things happening, and we don't have to privilege the reductionist place.
And it's like, the word just is doing a lot of work there. On the one hand,
Yes.
we're just chemicals. Well, yeah, we are. We're just made of atoms. Well, true, but that tells us almost nothing about
That's right.
what we are. So,
Right.
yes, we're a computer. It's like we're a computer, get over it, like we're made of matter, get over it. It's not a big deal. But we're so much more than that. It's not that we're made of matter. It's not that we're made of atoms. It's not that our brains are computers. It's what special kind of thing this brain is actually doing, which is unique. It's a mystery, and that's just an exciting scientific project to figure out what it actually is. We should celebrate the fact that we've learned these things. We've learned that we're chemicals. We've learned that we're made of matter and atoms, and we learn now that we're also computers. That's exciting. And so it leads to the capacity to solve more interesting problems. Had we not learned we were computers, then we wouldn't have this interesting question before us of what's the software that's running on this hardware that is the brain? Because if we can figure that out, again, we can figure out AGI, which a lot of people are trying to work on, going down avenues I think are completely blind alleys, but hey, if they're making progress in improving AI, good luck to them.
Yeah.
Well, my physicist friends who are determinists who don't like the idea of emergence because they feel like it's a word doing like and then a miracle happens. Well, no, that's not what we're talking about. I mean, so my counter to them is, where is inflation in your quantum physics equations? It's real. It exists. Everybody knows it has a huge effect, and the economy tries to do something about it, and economists study it, so on. It's an emergent property of all of us running around doing our thing. And there's tons of examples like that.
Have you heard, I've got to tell Michael, as I've got him captured here, the parable of the copper atom, and this comes out of David
The
copper atom. The
copper atom, okay.
It's the parable of the copper atom that comes from David Deutsch's book, The Fabric of Reality. And he talks about how in Parliament Square in London, there is a statue of Winston Churchill.
Oh, yes, where everybody rubs
Yeah. It's made of bronze. So at the tip of the nose of Winston Churchill's statue is a copper atom. Now let's ask the question, why is it there? Now your physicist friends might very well be satisfied with the explanation that, well, at the Big Bang, an explosion of space and time happened, and out of that came hydrogen and helium, so it coalesced into a star, and the star exploded, and then it produced iron and copper, amongst other things, which then coalesced into planets, and following all the dynamical laws of motion, eventually you end up with this copper atom at the tip of the statue of Winston Churchill. Now that descriptive analysis can be said about literally anything, anywhere, anytime, but it never explains why there is a copper atom at the tip of Winston Churchill's nose. In order to actually explain it, you would have to talk about, there was this guy called Hitler, and Hitler decided to take over, and then there was a war, and we build statues of people that we think are wonderful heroes, and that is why. So all of that is emergence. There's nothing there that is miraculous or supernatural. Emergence is just a way of talking about things that really do exist at a higher level than the fundamental laws of physics and motion of atoms.
Yeah. Do you know Judea Pearl's work on causality?
Causality, yes.
Yeah. So I was thinking about this.
Book of Why, I think you call it.
The Book of Why, yeah. Different levels of causality are a useful way to think about that. I was thinking about this with the assassination of Admiral Yamamoto, who orchestrated the attack on Pearl Harbor. And there's a whole book about this, how this was done, and that there was like 6 different planes that tracked down his plane and shot it down. And it wasn't quite clear which plane had the exact kill shot. And all the pilots go, well, I'm the one, So they're all taking credit for, I'm the one who killed Yamamoto. And but if you think about it, this isn't a Pearl's example, it's mine, but that, well, in fact, how did they know where his plane was? Well, the intelligence agents that were monitoring the transmissions of the Japanese military leaders and so on, they're the ones that tracked it down. So they're the cause. But wait a minute, who gave the assignment to send the planes out? Well, that was this general over here, or the admiral over here. Well, ultimately, it's all the way up to President Roosevelt that said, we have to defeat Japan. So he gets the credit for causing, and so on and so on.
Yeah. Free will is just an admission that we can create stuff, that the next idea we're going to have is unpredictable now. The next scientific theory that's going to be figured out next year is literally unpredictable now. It has to be created. After all, if it could be predicted now, then you would have that scientific theory now, which means it would need to be created in the future. And so you're not really predicting something that's happening in the future, you're creating it now. So you've got that strict contradiction. So free will is just, to me, a description of all of that. But some people want to imbue it with some kind of supernatural element.
Well, this is how I derive it, that I start with Heraclitus' principle that you cannot step into the same river twice, because it's not the same river and you're not the same person. Okay, so this only applies if we do not live in a block universe that's predetermined and everything that could happen has already happened, and that we're just in the movie and haven't seen it yet, but the screener on the outside of space and time has already seen. Okay, forget that, because that's not the universe we live in. And so the future hasn't happened yet. We're part of the causal net, and as we move forward from moment to moment, it is literally indetermined what my decision will be. Now, someone like Sam or Sapolsky will say, no, it's tumors all the way down, or it's neurons all the way down, or whatever. But no, because the future hasn't happened yet. And you can learn from the past and change what you're doing. So future Shermer is a different person than current Shermer. I know, like tomorrow I have to get up early, so I'm going to set my alarm tonight, and I'm going to put my clothes out, so that, because I know at 5:30 in the morning I'm going to be groggy and not wanting to get up, so I'll change the conditions now for the future. Well, we can do that, right? That's a kind of agency. I guess this would be under the compatibilism umbrella.
Yes.
Not the libertarian free will, where there's a little homunculus soul floating around up there, which I've never understood how that solves the problem in any case, because then it's just the soul making decisions for you, for your body, not you.
And again, this is another part of where the scientific rational perspective can still preserve something that was worthwhile, let's say in the holy books, where people do argue, well, the problem of theodicy, or, the problem of evil in the world, like God's supposed to be all powerful and all good. Why is there evil? Oh, we gave you free will. Okay, so they had the concept of free will. Well, good, let's preserve that. We might not have a need for an all powerful, all benevolent God, but there are things there that are useful. But again, that's not an argument for, let's pull the old Bible off the shelf and then run our lives according to it, even if there is now and again some things useful to be found within it.
Yeah.
Now, sorry, go ahead.
Well, you go.
Well, back to the God thing. It was just one of my Scientific American columns. I called it Shermer's Last Law, because it's not mine at all. It's, any sufficiently advanced, in this case, extraterrestrial intelligence is indistinguishable from God, not magic. And now I've modified it. Any sufficiently advanced far future human or AI would be indistinguishable from God. So what do most people mean by God? Omniscient and omnipotent, and maybe omnibenevolent, if they want to throw that in there. How would you know if something was omniscient? Because we're not, right? We're always going to be below knowing everything. And so it's always going to be just sufficiently advanced that it feels like they know everything. Well, at some point, the AGI is going to be like that, or the AI is going to be like that. And if we do encounter aliens, they're not going to be 5 years ahead of us. Like they think, the aliens crashed at Roswell and we back engineered their technology and it was 5 years ahead of vacuum tubes.
Yeah.
So we got silicon chips. It's like, really? The aliens are just that far ahead of us?
I agree. Yeah, they're more than likely going to be millions or billions of years ahead of us.
Yeah.
Or they're still in the effective equivalent of the Neolithic or something, or haven't evolved yet. But the interesting thing about that as well is, even if we did encounter the aliens that are a billion years more advanced, the only difference between us and them cognitively can only be what they know. It can't be something qualitatively different. It can only be quantitative in terms of they have a deeper understanding of the laws of physics, the nature of the universe, that kind of thing. Perhaps they have faster running minds, they've got the higher clock speeds, or they've got more, short-term memory, that kind of thing. But in terms of being able to have a particular idea, they could teach us. There would be nothing that they would know that we would be cognitively closed to.
So this
Same
is
with the AGI, by the way.
This is the principle of uniformitarianism. We assume that the laws of physics operate on the other side of the universe, in the past and the future. Of course, that could be wrong. It could be that the early universe had a slightly different physics, the far future universe, slightly different physics. But the idea is that if the aliens discover, if we encountered aliens, actually because they came here in spaceships, they have to understand physics and propulsion and aerodynamics and whatever in the same way we do, because that's the only way to get here, right? So we assume that the universe is uniform and that the discovery of the processes that drive it are the same for them and us, right?
Back in the late 90s, early 2000s, the University of New South Wales had a team where they developed this technique using the Keck telescopes in Hawaii, where they were looking at the distance between certain spectral lines. And that distance between these spectral lines, I think it was in magnesium or something like that, is determined by something called the fine structure constant, which has a particular value. And they were looking at very distant quasars, which the light was passing by very distant galaxies and eventually reaching us. And what they saw was an ever so slight difference between that fine structure constant over there and the one detected here on Earth. Front of Time magazine, it was all very exciting for a while there. People were saying laws of physics different on the other side of the universe. Perhaps we're glimpsing another universe, in fact. Well, it turns out a few years ago, of course, it was found to be experimental error. So all of this collapsed into, we didn't read the telescope data properly.
Right.
So, Michael, you've worked in skepticism and critical thinking for decades now, right? But you have this new book about truth. And I'm sure you've done tons of research about it and talked with people. What is the most interesting thing you've come across?
Well, pretty much everything we've been talking about is right out of my book. I mean, these are the big questions, right? How can you not encounter these issues if you're going to write about it? So, yeah, for me, yes. So we started Skeptic Magazine in '92, right? So it's 33 years of doing this professionally. You know, there's many issues here that I've kind of changed my mind about. One is how rational a being are humans? Now, I've spent most of my career arguing people are just crazy. They believe the weirdest, dumbest things. They're so irrational. You know, and in fact, all of the work of Tversky and Kahneman have shown how irrational we are. I mean, they sort of debunked the Homo economicus, you know, the rational utility maximizing model. But in fact, you know, there's new research now, people like Hugo Mercier, Dan Sperber, and others arguing that we're not that irrational, that it's all those Tversky and Kahneman experiments are set up to sort of trick people into not understanding what the actual choices are. They're usually like logic puzzles. You know, if here's the rule and you have 4 cards, and which cards do you turn over to see if the rule is true or not? You know, a lot of people are like, wait, what now? How do I? But if you phrase it in an ecologically friendly environment, like you're a bartender, you have to card somebody, and so you got 4 people sitting there at the bar, one's drinking Coke, do you need to card them? No. You know, and somebody's obviously old, do you need to? No. You know, so if you couch it that way, then people, they are pretty rational. So I'm now beginning to think that, in fact, I guess this would be a more Deutschian optimistic side of things. I think we are pretty good at this for the most part. You know, most people don't join cults. You know, so I've written a lot about cults. You know, Jim Jones and Jonestown and the Heaven's Gate and Scientology. Whoa! You know, how could people do these crazy things? In fact, what we don't know is the base rate. You know, base rate neglect. How many people took the Scientology personality test and said, whatever, that was amusing, and they didn't turn over their life savings to the church, right? Or how many people heard Jim Jones preaching in the 60s and 70s? They never joined the church. Or he said, we're moving down to Guyana. And how many people went, well, I'm not going to Guyana, right? We don't know, right? Or the Tinder swindler, the Netflix documentary about that guy, you know, kind of you know, getting these women to hand over tens of thousands of dollars to him. How did he do this? So they showed how it's done. It's a pretty elaborate scam, and he was quite good at it. But what we don't know is what's the base rate. They had 4 women in this show who fell for it. But how many women did he try this on? You know, 100? You know, 1,000? You know, hardly ever works, but he, you know, here are the ones, right? So I do think I'm more optimistic this way, that I think for the future of problem solving, I think we're pretty rational.
Yeah.
Isn't David's next book called Irrationality?
I think so, yeah. It's going to be a response to things like, you know, my thing is a YouTube channel where I break down books. I took Pinker's book, Rationality, and sort of took a deep dive into that. And David's book, by coincidence, I think he might have been thinking about calling it Rationality, but then Pinker took that, so he's going to call it Irrationality. I don't have any special insight about the content of the book. I can imagine that David's going to talk about the fact that error is inevitable, that people make mistakes, and making mistakes is a necessary part of progress. You know, you're going to attempt something and 9 times out of 10 it's going to fail. It's the same as in science. The majority of the work of a scientist is going to be the errors that they make, and eventually they're going to come across something that's true. So when people write about how to become better critical thinkers or how to become more rational, it's almost like they're trying to divide the world up into, here's the good people and the bad people. If you follow my recipe to become more rational and you learn about these particular techniques about how to be, speaking of Nick Bostrom, he's got that whole thing in Superintelligence about how to be a better Bayesian, for example. He wants that, how to interpret evidence. We should all be more scientifically minded. Now, a lot of these things are good heuristics and so on and so forth, but people can make progress in the areas they're interested in. And not everyone's going to be interested in making progress in science. Many people, just interested in raising a family. And if they're doing that well and, their kids are well adjusted and that kind of thing, they are making progress, generating knowledge, correcting errors and so on and so forth. So they're just as rational as anyone else, even if because they're not particularly interested in certain things, they have some strange ideas to the rest of us. The rest of us who are sort of interested in these questions, they might be sitting back, they've got the crucifix in the corner, they've got the Bible, but they're just as rational as the rest of us, but they just haven't really thought deeply about these things. They've been thinking deeply about other things.
I think some people have what I call logic type compartments. They just don't want to think about it in that way. They just go, well, that's my faith, and full stop. Okay. Where do you go with that? It's sort of the end of the conversation to me. I remember I've told this story before on my podcast of Richard Dawkins and I were on stage together at this Science and Religion conference, and Ken Miller was on the stage. Ken wrote the definitive debunking of intelligent design creationist arguments about cells and the bacterial flagellum and DNA and all that stuff. And basically, this is all bullshit, and here's why. But the last chapter of his book is like, and by the way, I'm a Catholic and I accept Jesus as my savior. The whole thing, And so Richard's like, all right, Ken, let's say we found a piece of the true cross. And on a piece of the true cross is a little bit of flesh, and we can extract the DNA. Now, he's born of a virgin, right? So he's going to have, and Ken could see where this was going. He's like, Richard, I'm not claiming any of this is true. I'm a Catholic. This is what we believe. And it's like, okay. Well, so in other words, stop. Okay, I don't know why people, to me, let's just go as far as we can with reason and science, and don't believe it if there's not a good reason to believe it. I don't know.
In terms of finding truth, now that you've written this book, Deutsch talks about how, I can give two quotes here. One, he delivered a lecture that's online about the nature of truth, where he talks about the difference between statements and propositions.
Oh, yeah.
And he says that truth is a property of propositions. However, we can never utter a proposition. We can only utter statements, which are at best approximations to propositions. That's one quote.
Yeah.
And I'll throw another one
Okay.
in, which is, and this is from The Fabric of Reality, chapter 10. It's probably the one that I quote the most often, which
Oh my
is...
God, you sound like one of these Bible thumpers.
I know, a little bit.
Chapter verse.
Chapter verse,
Yeah.
which is, it's about mathematics and the nature of mathematics, because people think that whatever domain we're talking about, mathematics is this one pristine area where finally we can get to the truth. All mathematics teachers are proud of standing in front of their students and going, off there in science class, you might be able to be highly confident, but you'll never get the perfect truth. Here, we've got the perfect truth. Now, what Deutsch says about that is, quote, necessary truth is the subject matter of mathematics. It's not the reward we get for doing mathematics. Now, I think that's really, really powerful, because it's almost like in science, my other example there is that like particle physicists are looking for the fundamental constituents of matter. But at any given moment, what they have are their best guess about what the fundamental constituents of matter are. At the moment, you say the smallest particles are quarks and leptons, but we don't know that there's not something inside of an electron, for example. So the subject matter, the fundamental particles of particle physics, and the knowledge of the subject matter are quite separate things. What do you think about that when it comes to truth? Can we actually get to a final truth?
So philosopher makes a distinction between a priori and a posteriori truths. So if I say pediatricians are doctors, well, you only have to just look up to see what the words mean to know if it's true or not. But if I say pediatricians are rich, well, you actually have to go outside and look, that is, collect some data and see, are they rich or are they not rich, right? So that one is true by definition. The sum of the angles of a triangle are 180 degrees in Euclidean geometry. That's just true by definition, right? That's most of the truths we're interested in are a posteriori. You actually have to look out the window. This is my trouble with philosophers' thought experiments. they go on and on and on, and therefore, they end up at this conclusion. It's like, yeah, but did you ever look out the window to see if the world's actually like what you're talking about? Because usually it's not. So the determinists are people like Sam and Sapolsky. I've talked to endlessly about this stuff. And they get themselves wrapped up in these thought experiments, and then they end up. So therefore, there's no human volition or choice. Like, hang on, let's look to see what people actually do and study how that's done. There's psychologists that work with people that have addictions and tumors or whatever. And that's very different from the people that don't have the addictions. Why is there a difference there? That kind of thing. And anyway, so I just, that distinction is useful.
Yeah, if you don't have volition, then you've still got a lot of explaining to do. Like, forget, you don't even need to refer to the term free will. It's like, why are people so different to every other system that we know about? What is this unpredictability? You're still left with a mystery. You might not want to call it free will, but something very unique is going on there.
I mean, even identical twins raised in the same home are actually pretty different. And the behavior geneticists that study this, they don't have an explanation. They just say the non-shared environment. Well, what is that? Well, because even in the home, they carve out little niches from themselves that are slightly different. But it's worse than that. Even in the womb, which one's on top, which is on the bottom, they get slightly different chemicals from the mother, nutrients and so on. Which twin got the upper bunk and the lower bunk, and which one went left instead of right, or met this person instead of that. And there's just a billion or trillion or whatever, endless number of these little bifurcations, the garden of forking paths. Even so, here's how I apply that to the mind uploading thought experiment. Again, these thought experiments. Okay. All right. So, the moment that my self or whatever is uploaded to the cloud and I'm still alive, that's not me. That's just a copy of me. And now it's starting to lead a slightly different life than mine. Remember the Star Trek episode where Riker beams down to the planet and there he is. It's him. And it's like, whoa. It turns out the transporter duplicated him because the transporter is always screwing up, which is convenient for the screenwriters have to develop plots, right? And then he finds out that he had this relationship with Counselor Troy, and oh boy, I get to go. No, that's over now. Oh, right. But that's not him. It's a different him. There's now two different selves. So I don't see what the people that want to achieve immortality by mind uploading. To me, they're conceptually flawed. That's not you. It's just a copy of you. So I define the self as the point of view self. It's me from one moment to the next, in a coherent fashion. If I go to sleep, that breaks up, but I come back, If I go under general anesthesia, I'm back online afterwards. And so uploading my mind, and now I'm up there, but I'm not up there. I'm sitting here with you. And that's just a copy of Shermer, right? So anyway, that's it.
Jean Lanier has a thought experiment where he says, assume you want to turn yourself immortal, okay, but we're not going to do the upload thing. Instead, we're going to take your brain and one neuron at a time, we're going to replace it with something that's more robust, silicon. In fact, forget about...
I know that one, from it to bit, right?
And or you could even forget the silicon, you could actually have laser systems, okay? So now we've got something purely abstract representing the brain. At that point, there's no discontinuity between when you're conscious sitting here now and when you are nothing but bits.
Yeah, so that's the only way I can think of to continue for immortality. Like being cryonically frozen and brought back, this is not possible, but if it were, that would just be like a long sleep. I don't care how long I sleep or how long I'm under general anesthesia, as long as I'm come back, then I'm okay. I think that would be the only way to do it. In other words, you have to continue indefinitely.
But in a sense, aren't you also like yesterday, you were Michael Shermer, you went to sleep, you woke up. There's kind of a discontinuity there as well. So
yeah, but it comes back online, right? Hopefully.
Well, don't you go, if you were to go offline and then be uploaded somewhere else, then you come back online?
Yes, if I woke up there, but I'm claiming that wouldn't happen.
Right.
Because let's say we did that instead of my just being erased and dead. We just slid me into an fMRI, copied my connectome, uploaded it to the cloud, turned it on, and then slid me back out and said, Shermer, you're up there. And I'm going, no, I'm right here. I'm looking at you. This is me.
But the uploaded person would presumably be thinking,
if that's the case, so people like Michio Kaku, who writes about this, he says, that's just two of you now. So
Yes.
the self is, we have to redefine the self.
Mm.
Okay, well, all right.
Yeah. We'll worry about it when it becomes.
Yeah,
a
we're
problem.
worried about it when that.
I'm
Yeah.
sure we could chat about this all day, but I've had a great time just listening to you guys. This is amazing. Thank you again, Michael. Thank you, Brett.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you. Great.
Where can people find you, Michael?
Skeptic.com is the main source for my magazine, and michaelshermer.com.
Great.
Yeah.
Brett.
BrettHall.org and look up Topcast on YouTube.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Keep watching.